Well, good evening, everyone. Everybody's looking pretty good and cozy there around this fire. It's a good springtime fire. You notice that wood that we're burning in the springs, a lot of sparks popping up, and it's all laid under the snow in the winter, and it's dried out enough to burn now, and it's just nice wood. Good and warm, big flames, kind of stuff we like. That's why we're here around the fire. Well, that to tell some stories. And speaking of stories, I've got 5 more chapters of that good old story, The Untamed by Max Brand. And those are the last 5 chapters of this story. Now this is where it all comes together. So I want to get everybody to get their mug filled up. And let's take this thing to the end. Gonna be some shooting. Gonna be some excitement. Let's see what happens, folks. Chapter 33, The Song of the Untamed. Buck and his father were learning of 1,000 crimes charged against Dan. Wherever a man riding a black horse committed an outrage, it was laid to the account of this new and most terrible of long riders. 2 cowpunchers were found dead on the plains. Their half-emptied revolvers lay close to their hands, and their horses were not far off. In ordinary times, it would have been accepted that they'd killed each other, for they were known enemies. But now men had room for one thought only. And why should not a man with the courage to take an outlaw from the center of Elkhead be charged with every crime on the range? Jim Silent had been a grim plague, but at least he was human. This devil defied death. These were both sad and happy days for Kate. The chief cause of her sadness, strangely enough, was the rapidly returning strength of Dan. While he was helpless, he belonged to her. When he was strong, he belonged to his vengeance on Jim Silent. And when she heard Dan whistling softly his own wild, weird music, she knew its meaning as she would have known the wail of a hungry wolf on a winter night. It was the song of the Untamed. She never spoke of her knowledge. She took the happiness of the moment to her heart, closed her eyes against tomorrow. Then came an evening when she watched Dan play with Black Bart. A game of tag in which they darted about the room with a violence which threatened to wreck a furniture, but running with such soft footfalls that there was no sound except the rattle of Bart's claws against the floor and the rush of their breath. They came to an abrupt stop, and Dan dropped into a chair while Black Bart sank upon his haunches and snapped at the hand, which Dan flicked across his face with lightning movements. The master fell motionless and silent. His eyes forgot the wolf. Rising, they rested on Kate's face. They rose again and looked past her. She understood and waited. "Kate," he said at last, "I've got to start on the trail." Her smile went out. She looked where she knew his eyes were staring, through the window and far out across the hills where the shadows deepened, dropped slanting and black across the hollows. Far away, a coyote wailed. The wind which swept the hills seemed to her like a refrain of Dan's whistling, the song and the summons of the Untamed. "That trail will never bring you home," she said. There was a long silence. "You ain't crying, honey." "I'm not crying, Dan. I got to go." "Yes." "Kate, you got a dying whisper in your voice." "That will pass, dear." "Why, honey, you are crying." He took her face between his hands and stared into her misted eyes. But then his glance wandered past her, through the window, out to the shadowy hills. "You won't leave me now," she pleaded. "I must. Give me 1 more hour there. Just 1 more hour." "Look," he said, and he pointed. She saw Black Bart reared up with his forepaws resting on the windowsill, while he looked into the thickening night with the eyes of the hunter which sees in the dark. "The wolf knows, Kate," he said, "but I can't explain." He kissed her forehead, but she strained close to him and raised her lips. She cried, "My whole soul is on them." "Not that," he said huskily. "There's still blood on my lips, and I'm going to go get them clean." He was gone through the door with the wolf racing before him. She stumbled after him, her arms outspread, blind with tears. And then, seeing that he was gone indeed, she dropped into the chair, buried her face against the place where his head had rested, and wept. Far away the coyotes wailed again, and this time nearer. Chapter 34, The Coward. Before the coyote cried again, 3 shadows glided into the night. The lighted window in the house was like a staring eye that searched after them, but Satan, with the wolf running before, vanished quickly among the shadows of the hills. They were glad. They were loosed in the void of the mountain desert with no destiny save the will of their master. They seemed like one being rather than 3. The wolf was the eyes, the horse was the strong body to flee or pursue, and the man was the brain which directed and the power which struck. He had formulated no plan of action to free Buck and kill Silent. All he knew was that he must reach the Long Riders at once, and he would learn their whereabouts from Morris. He rode more slowly as he approached the hotel of the sheriff. Lights burned at the dining room windows. Probably the host still sat at table with his guests, but it was strange that they should linger over their meal so late. He had hoped that he could be able to come upon Morris by surprise. Now he must take him in the midst of many men. With Black Bart slinking at his heels, he walked softly across the porch, tiptoed through the front room. The door to the dining room was wide. Around the table sat a dozen men with the sheriff at their head. The latter, somewhat red of face, as if from the effort of a long speech, was talking low and earnestly, sometimes brandishing his clenched fist with such violence that it made his flabby cheeks quiver. "We'll get to the house right after dawn," he was saying, "because that's the time when most men are so thick-headed with sleep that—" "Well, not Whistlin Dan Barry," said one of the men, shaking his head. "He won't be thick-headed. Remember, I seen him work in Elkhead when he slipped through the hands of a room full of us." A growl of agreement went around the table, and Black Bart, in sympathy, echoed the noise softly. "What's that?" called the sheriff, raising his head sharply. Dan, with a quick gesture, made Black Bart slink a pace back. "Nothing," replied one of the men. "This business is getting on your nerves, Sheriff. I don't blame you. It's getting on mine." "Well, I'm trusting to you boys to stand back of me all through," said the sheriff with a sort of a whine. "But I'm thinking that we won't have no trouble. When we see him, we won't stop for no questions to be asked, but turn loose with our 6 guns and shoot him down like a dog. He's not human, and he don't deserve— Oh, God." He started up from his chair, white-faced, with hands high above his head, staring at the apparition of Whistlin Dan, who stood with 2 revolvers covering the posse. Every man was on his feet instantly, with arms straining stiffly up. The muzzles of their revolvers are like the eyes of some portraits. No matter from what angle you look at them, they seem directly straight at you. And every cowpuncher in the room was sure that he was the main object of Dan's aim. "Morris," said Dan. "For God's sake, don't shoot," screamed the sheriff. Get down on your knees. Watch him, Bart." As the sheriff sank obediently to his knees, the wolf slipped up to him with a stealthy stride and stood half crouched, his teeth bared, silent. No growl could have made Bart more terribly threatening. Dan turned completely away from Morris so that he could keep a more careful watch on the others. "Call off your wolf," moaned Morris, a sob of terror in his voice. "I ought to let him set his teeth in you," said Dan, "but I'm going to let you off if you'll tell me what I want to know." "Yes, anything. Where is Jim Silent?" All eyes flashed toward Morris. The latter, as their significance of the question came home to him, went even a sicklier white, like the belly of a dead fish. His eyes moved swiftly about the circle of his posse. Their answering glares were sternly forbidding. "Out with it," commanded Dan. The sheriff strove mightily to speak, but only a ghastly whisper came. "You got the wrong tip, Dan. I don't know nothing about Silent. I'd have him in jail if I did." "Bart," said Dan. The wolf slunk closer to the kneeling man. His hot breath fanned the face of the sheriff, and his lips grinned still farther back from that keen, white teeth. "Help!" yelled Morris. "He's at that shanty up on Bald Eagle Creek." A rumble, half cursing and half an articulate snarl of brute rage, rose from the cowpunchers. "Bart!" called Dan again, and leaped back from the door, raced out to Satan, and drove into the night at a dead gallop. Half the posse rushed after him. A dozen shots were pumped after the disappearing shadowy figure. 2 or 3 jumped into their saddles. The others called him back. "Don't be an ass, Monty," said one. "You got a good hoss, but you ain't fool enough to think he can catch Satan." They trooped back into the dining room and gathered in a silent circle around the sheriff, whose little fear-bright eyes went from face to face. "Ah, this is the swine," said one, "that was guarding our lives." "Fellers," pleaded the sheriff desperately, "I swear to you that I just heard where Silent was today, and I was keeping it dark until after we got Whistlin Dan. Then I was going to lead you—" The flat of a heavy hand struck with a resounding thwack across his lips. He reeled back again the wall, sputtering the blood from his split mouth. "Pat," said Monty, "your hoss is done for. Will you stay here and see that they don't get away? We'll do something with him when we get back." Pat caught the sheriff by his shirt collar and jerked him to a chair. The body of the fat man was trembling like shaken jelly, and the posse turned away. They could not overtake Whistlin Dan on his black stallion, but they might arrive before Silent and his gang got underway. Their numbers were over small to attack the formidable Long Riders, but they wanted blood. Before Whistlin Dan reached the valley of Bald Eagle Creek, they were in the saddle and riding hotly in pursuit. Now, here's chapter 35. Closing in. In that time-ruined shack towards which the posse and Dan Barry rode, the outlaws sat about on the floor eating their supper when Hal Purvis entered. He had missed the trail from the Salton place to the Bald Eagle 6 times that day, and that had not improved his bitter mood. "You been gone long enough," growled Silent. "Sit down and chow and tell us what you know." "I don't eat with no damn traitors," said Purvis savagely. "Stand up and tell us that you're a double-crossing hound, Buck Daniels." "You better turn in and sleep," said Buck calmly. "I've knowed men before that loses their reason for wanting to sleep." "Jim," said Purvis, turning sharply on the chief, "Barry is at Buck's house." "You lie," said Buck. "Do I lie?" said Purvis, grinding his teeth. "I seen Black Bart hanging around your house." Jim Silent reached out a heavy paw and dropped it on the shoulder of Buck. Their eyes met through a long moment, and then the glance of Buck wavered and fell. "Buck," said Silent, "I like you. I don't want to believe what Purvis says. Give me your word of honor that Whistlin Dan—" "He's right, Jim," said Buck. "And he dies like a yeller cur," broke in Purvis, snarling. "No," said Silent. "When one of the boys goes back on the gang, they pay me, not the rest of you. Daniels, take your gun and get down to the other end of the room and stand with your face to the wall. I'll stay at this end. Keep your arms folded. Haynes, you stand over there to count up to 3. Then holler fire, and we'll turn and start shooting. The rest of you can be judge if that's fair." "Too damn fair," said Kilduff. "I say string him up and drill the skunk full of holes." Without a word, Buck turned on his heel. "One moment," said Haynes. "He ain't your meat, Lee," said Silent. "Just keep your hand out of this." "I only wish to ask him a question," said Haynes. He turned to Buck. "Do you mean to say that after Barry's wolf cut up your arm, you've been giving Whistlin Dan a shelter from the law, and from us?" "I give him a place to stay because he was damn near death," said Buck. "And there's one thing you'll answer for in hell, Haynes, and that's riding off and leaving the man that got you out of Elkhead. He was bleeding to death." "Shot?" said Haynes, changing color. Silent broke in. "Buck, go take your place and say your prayers." "Stay where you are," commanded Haynes. "And the girl?" "He was lying sick in bed, raving about Delilah and Kate, so I come and got the girl." Haines dropped his head. And when he was lying there, said Silent fiercely, you could have made an end to him without half lifting your hand, and you didn't. Silent, said Haines. If you want to talk, speak to me. What in the hell you mean, Lee? You can't get at Buck except through me. Because that devil Barry got a bullet for your sake and you're going to... I've lived a rotten life, said Haines. And I suppose you think this is a pretty good way of dying, sneered Silent. I have more cause to fight for Barry than Buck has, said Haines. Lee, we've been pals too long. Silent, I've hated you like a snake ever since I met you. But outlaws can't choose their company. His tawny head rose. He stared haughtily across the circle of lowering faces. By God, said Silent, white with passion, I'm beginning to think you do hate me. Get down there and take your place. You're first and Daniels comes next. Kilduff, you can count. He stalked to the end of the room. Haines lingered one moment. Buck, he said, there's one chance in 10,000 that I'll make this draw the quickest of the two. If and I don't, you may live through it. Tell Kate, Haines, get to your mark or I'll start shooting. Haines turned and took his place. The others drew back along the walls of the room. Kilduff took the lamp from the table and held it high above his head. Even then the light was dim and uncertain, and the draught set the flame a-wavering, so that the place was shaken with shadows. The moon sent a feeble shaft of light through the window. One, said Kilduff. The shoulders of Haines and Silent hunched slightly. Two, said Kilduff. God, whispered someone. Three, fire! They whirled, their guns exploding at almost the same instant, and Silent lunged for the floor, firing twice as he fell. Haines' second shot split the wall behind Silent. If the outlaw chief had remained standing, the bullet would have passed through his head. But as Silent fired the third time, the revolver dropped clattering from the hands of Haines. Buck caught him as he toppled inertly forward, coughing blood. Silent was on his feet instantly. Stand back, he roared to his men who crowded about the fallen long rider. Stand back in your places. I ain't finished. I'm just started. Buck, take your place. Boys, pleaded Buck, he's not dead and he'll bleed to death unless... Damn him, let him bleed. Stand up, Buck, or by God, I'll shoot you while you kneel there. Shoot and be damned. He tore off his shirt and ripped away a long strip for a bandage. The revolver poised in Silent's hands. Buck, I'm warning you for the last time. Fellers, it's murder and damnation for all if you let Haines die this way, cried Buck. The shining barrel of the revolver dropped to a level. I've given you a man's chance, said Silent. And now you'll have the chance. The door at the side of the room jerked open and a revolver cracked. The lamp shivered to 1,000 pieces in the hands of Bill Kilduff. All the room was reduced to a place of formless shadows, dimly lighted by the shaft of moonlight. The voice of Jim Silent, strangely changed and sharpened from his usual bass roar, shrilled over the sudden tumult. Each man for himself, it's Whistlin Dan! Terry Jordan and Bill Kilduff rushed at that dim figure crouched to the floor. Their guns spat fire, but they merely lighted the way to their own destruction. Twice Dan's revolver spoke, and they dropped a-yelling. Pandemonium fell on the room. The long riders raced here and there, and the revolvers coughed fire. For an instant, Hal Purvis stood framed against the pallid moonshine at the window. He stiffened and pointed an arm towards the door. The werewolf, he screamed. As if to answer the call, Black Bart raced across the room. Twice the revolver sounded from the hands of Purvis. Then a shadow leaped from the floor. There was a flash of white teeth, and Purvis lurched to one side and dropped, screaming terribly. The door banged. Suddenly there was silence. The clatter of a galloping horse outside drew swiftly away. Dan, here, thank God. Buck, one got away. If it was Silent, here, bring some matches. Someone was dragging himself towards the door in a hopeless effort to escape. Several others groaned. You there, called Buck. Stay where you are. The man who struggled towards the door flattened himself against the floor, moaning pitifully. "Quick," said Dan, "light a match. Morris's posse is at my heels. No time. If Silent escaped—" A match flared in the hands of Buck. "Who's that? Haynes?" "Let him alone, Dan. I'll tell you why later. There's Jordan and there's Kilduff. The one by the door is Reinhardt." They ran from one to the other, greeted by groans and deep curses. "Who's that beneath the window?" "Too small for Silent. It's Purvis, and he's dead. Bart got him." "No, it was fear that killed him. Look at his face." "Bart, go out to Satan." The wolf trotted from the room. "My God, Buck, I've done all this for nothing. It was Silent that got away." "What's that?" Over the groans of the wounded came the sound of running horses. Not one, but many. Then a call. "Close in, close in." "The posse," said Dan. As he jerked open the door, a bullet smashed the wood above his head. 3 horsemen were closing around Satan and Black Bart. He leaped back into the room. "They've got Satan, Buck. We've got to try it on foot. Go through the window." "They've got nothing on me. I'll stick with Haynes." Dan jumped through the window and raced to the shelter of a big rock. He'd hardly dropped behind it when the 4 horsemen galloped around the corner of the house. "Johnson and Sullivan," ordered the voice of Monty sharply. "Watch the window. They're lying low inside, but we've got Barry's horse and wolf. Now we'll get him." "Come out or we'll burn the house down," thundered a voice from the other side. "We surrendered," called Buck within. A cheer came from the posse. Sullivan and Johnson ran for the window that they had been told to guard. The door on the other side of the house slammed open. "It's a slaughterhouse," cried one of the posse. Dan left the sheltering rock and raced around the house, keeping a safe distance and dodging from rock to rock. He saw Satan and Black Bart guarded by 2 men with revolvers in their hands. He might have shot them down, but the distance was too great for accurate gunplay. So he whistled shrilly. The 2 guards wheeled toward him, and as they did, Black Bart, leaping, caught one by the shoulder, whirled him around and around with the force of the spring. The other fired at Satan, who raced off towards the sound of the whistle. It was an easy shot, but in the utter surprise of the instant, the bullet went wide. Before he could fire again, Satan was coming to a halt beside Dan. "Help!" yelled the cattleman. "Whistlin Dan!" The other guard opened fire wildly. 3 men ran from the house. All they saw was a black shadow which melted instantly into the night. Now this is chapter 36, Fear. Into the dark he rode. Somewhere in the mountains was Silent, and now alone. In Dan's mouth, the old salt taste of his own blood was unforgotten. It was a wild chase. He had only the faintest clues to guide him, yet he managed to keep close on the trail of the great outlaw. After several days, he rode across a tall, red-roan stallion, a mere wreck of a horse with lean sides, a pendant head, and glazed eyes. It was a long moment before Dan recognized Silent's peerless mount, Red Pete. The outlaw had changed his exhausted horse for a common pony. The end of the long trail must be near. The whole range followed that chase with breathless interest. It was like the race of Hector and Achilles around the walls of Troy. And when they met, there would be a duel of giants. Twice Whistlin Dan was sighted. Once Jim Silent fought a running duel with a posse fresh from Elkhead. The manhunters were alert, but it was their secret hope that the 2 famous outlaws would destroy each other. But how the wild chase would end, no one could know. At last, Buck Daniels rode to tell Kate Cumberland strange news. When he stumbled into the ranch house, Kate and her father rose, white-faced. There was an expression of waiting terror in their eyes. "Buck!" cried Joe. "Hush, Dad," said Kate. "It hasn't come yet. Buck, what has happened?" "The end of the world has come for Dan," he said. "The devil's Silent." "Dan!" cried Joe and rushed around the table to Buck. "Silent has dared Dan to meet him at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon in Tully's saloon at Elkhead. He's held up 4 men in the last 24 hours and told them that he'll be at Tully's tomorrow and will expect Dan to be there." "It isn't possible," cried Kate. "That means that Silent has given himself up to the law." Buck laughed bitterly. The law will not put a hand on them if it thinks that they'll fight it out together, he said. There will be a crowd in the saloon, and not a hand will stir to arrest Silent till after the fight. But Dan won't go to Tully's, broke in old Joe. If Silent is crazy enough to do such a thing, Dan won't be. He will, said Kate. I know. You got to stop him, urged Buck. You've got to get to Elkhead and turn Dan back. Aye, said Joe, for even if he kills Silent, the crowd will tackle him after the fight. 100 against 1. She shook her head. You won't go? Not a step. But Kate, don't you understand? I couldn't turn Dan back. This is his chance to meet Silent. Do you dream anyone could turn him back? The two men were mute. You're right, said Buck at last. I hoped for a minute that you could do it, but now I remember the way it was in that dark shanty up in the Bald Eagle Creek. You can't turn a wolf from a trail, and Whistlin Dan has never forgotten the taste of his own blood. Kate, called her father suddenly. What's the matter, honey? With bowed head and faltering steps, she was leaving the room. Buck caught old Joe by the arm and held him back as he would have followed. Let her be, said Buck sharply. Maybe she'll want to see you at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, but until then she'll want to be alone. There'll be ghosts enough with her all the time. You can lay to that. Joe Cumberland wiped his glistening forehead. There ain't nothing we can do, Buck, but sit and wait. Buck drew a long breath. What devil gave Silent that idea? Fear. Jim Silent don't know what fear is. Anyone can see that yeller burn in Dan's eyes knows what fear is. Buck winced. Cumberland went on. Every night Silent has been seeing them eyes that grow yaller in the dark. They lie in wait for him in every shadow. Between dark and dawn he dies 100 deaths. He can't stand it no more. He's going to die. Something tells him that, but he wants to die where there's humans around, and when he dies he wants to pull Dan down with him. They sat staring at each other for a long time. If he lives through that fight with Silent, said Buck sadly, the crowd will jump in on him. Their numbers will make 'em brave. And then? Then maybe he'd like a friend to fight by his side, said Buck simply. So long, Joe. The old man wrung his hand and then followed him out to the hitching rack where Buck's horse stood. Ain't Dan got no friends amongst the crowd, he said. Don't they give him no thanks for catching the rest of Silent's gang? Oh, they give him lots of credit, said Buck. And Haynes has said a lot in favor of Dan, explaining how the jail busting took place. Lee has sure proven himself a white man. He's getting well of his wounds, and it's said that the governor will pardon him. You see, Haynes went bad because the law done him dirt long time ago. The governor's still taking that into account. But they'd still want to kill Dan? Half of the boys wouldn't, said Buck. The other half is all wrought up over the killing that's been happening on the range in the last month. Dan is accused of about even half of them, and the friends of dead men don't waste no time listening to arguments. They say Dan's an outlawed man and that they're going to treat him like one. Damn them, groaned Cumberland. Don't Morris' confession make no difference? Hell, Morris was lynched before he had a chance to swear what he said in Dan's favor. Kilduff and Jordan and Reinhardt might testify that Dan wasn't ever bought over by Silent, but they know they're done for themselves, and they won't try to help anybody else, particularly the man that put them in the hands of the law. Kilduff has sworn that Dan was bribed by Silent, that he went after Silent not for revenge, but to get some more money out of him, and that the fight in that shanty up at Bald Eagle Creek was because Silent refused to give Dan any more money. Then there ain't no hope, muttered Cumberland. But, oh, lad, it breaks my heart to think of Kate. Dan can only die once, but every minute is a death to her. And this is chapter 37. And this is the title of Death. Before noon of the next day, Buck joined the crowd which had been growing for hours around Tully's saloon. Men gave way before him, whispering. He was a marked man, the friend of Whistlin Dan Barry. Cowpunchers who had known him all his life now avoided his eyes, but caught him with side glances. He smiled grimly to himself, reading their minds. He was more determined than ever to stand or fall with Whistlin Dan that day. There was not an officer of the law in sight. If one were present, it would be his manifest duty to apprehend the outlaws as soon as they appeared, and the plan was to allow them to fight out their quarrel and perhaps kill each other. Arguments began to rise among separate groups where the crimes attributed to Whistlin Dan Barry were numbered and talked over. It surprised Buck to discover the number who believed these stories which he and Haynes had told. They made a strong faction, though manifestly in the minority. Hardly a man who did not, from time to time, nervously fumble the butt of a six-gun. As 3 o'clock drew on, the talk grew less and less. It broke out now and again in little uneasy bursts. Someone would tell a joke. Half-hysterical laughter would greet it and die suddenly as it begun. These were hard-faced men of the mountain desert, warriors of the frontier. What unnerved them was the strangeness of the thing which was about to happen. The big wooden clock on the side of the long barroom struck once for 2:30, and all talk ceased. Men seemed unwilling to meet each other's eyes. Some of them drummed lightly on the top of the bar and strove to whistle, but the only sound that came through their dried lips was a whisper and rush of breath. A gray-haired cattle ranger commenced to hum in a tune, very low but distinct. Finally a man rose, strode across the room, shook the old fellow by the shoulder with brutal violence, and with a curse ordered him to stop his damned death song. Everyone drew a long breath of relief. The minute hand crept on towards 3 o'clock. Now it was 20 minutes, now 15, now 10, now 5. Then a clatter of hooves, a heavy step on the porch, and the giant form of Jim Silent blocked the door. His hands rested on the butts of 2 guns. Buck guessed at the tremendous strength of that grip. The eyes of the outlaw darted about the room, and every glance dropped before his, with the exception of Buck's fascinated stare. For he saw a brand on the face of the great long rider. It lay in no one thing. It was not the unusual hollowness of eyes and cheeks. It was not the feverish brightness of his glance. It was something which included all of these. It was the fear of death by night. His hands fell away from the guns. He crossed the room to the bar, nodded his head at the bartender. "Drink," he said, and his voice was only a whisper without body of sound. The bartender, with pasty face, round and blank, did not move either his hand or his fascinated eyes. There was a twitch of the outlaw's hand, and naked steel gleamed. Instantly, revolvers showed in every hand. A youngster moaned. The sound seemed to break the charm. Silent put back his great head and burst into a deep-throated laughter. The gun whirled in his hand, and the butt crashed heavily on the bar. "Drink, damn you," he thundered. "Step up and drink to the health of Jim Silent." The wavering line slowly approached the bar. Silent pulled out his other gun and shoved them both across the bar. "Take 'em," he said. "I don't want 'em to get restless and muss up this joint." The bartender took them as if they were covered with some deadly poison, and the outlaw stood unarmed. It came suddenly to Buck what this whole maneuver meant. He gave away his guns in order to tempt someone to arrest him. Better the hand of the law than the yellow glare of them following eyes. Yet not a man moved to apprehend him. Unarmed, he still seemed more dangerous than 6 common men. The long rider jerked a whiskey bottle upside down over a glass. Half the contents splashed across the bar. He turned and faced the crowd, his hand dripping with the spilled liquor. "Who's liquorin'?" he bellowed. Not a sound answered him. "Damn your yeller souls, then all by myself I'll drink to—" He stopped short, his eyes wild, his head tilted back. One by one the cowpunchers gave back foot by foot softly until they stood close to the opposite wall of the saloon. All the bar was left to Silent. The whiskey glass slipped from his hand and crashed on the floor. In his face was the meaning of the sound he heard, and now it came to their own ears. A whistle, thin and distant, but clear. Only phrases at first, but now it rose more distinct. The song of the Untamed, the terror and the beauty of the mountain desert, both a plea and a threat. The clock struck, sharp, hurried, brazen. 1, 2, 3. Before the last quick, unmusical chime died out, Black Bart stood in the entrance to the saloon. His eyes were upon Jim Silent, who stretched out his arms on either side and gripped the edge of the bar. Yet even when the wolf glided silently across the room and crouched before the bandit, at watch, his lips grinned back from the white teeth. The man had no eyes for him. Instead, his stare held steadily upon that open door, and on his raised face there was still the terror of that whistling which slept closer and closer. It ceased. A footfall crossed the porch. How different from the ponderous stride of Jim Silent. This was like the padding step of the panther, and Whistlin Dan stood in the door. He did not fill it as the burly shoulders of Silent had done. He seemed almost as slender as a girl, and infinitely boyish in his grace. A strange figure, surely, to make all these hardened fighters of the mountain desert crouch and stiffen their fingers around the butts of their revolvers. His eyes were upon Silent, and how they lighted. His face changed as the face of the great god Pan must have altered when he blew into the instrument of reeds and made perfect music, the first in the world. "Bart," said the gentle voice, "go out to Satan." The wolf turned and slipped from the room. It was a little thing, but to the men who saw it, it was terrible to watch an untamed beast obey the voice of a man. Still, with that light panther step, he crossed the barroom, and now he was looking up into the face of the giant. The huge, long rider loomed above Dan. There was not terror which set his face in written lines. It was horror, such as a man feels when he stands face to face with the unearthly in the middle of night. This was open daylight, in a room thronged with men, yet in it nothing seemed to live save the smile of Whistlin Dan. He drew out the 2 revolvers and slipped them onto the bar. They stood, unarmed, yet they seemed no less dangerous. Silent's arms crept closer to his sides. He seemed gathering himself by degrees. The confidence in his own great size showed in his face, and the bloodlust of battle in his eyes answered the yellow light in Dan's. Dan spoke. "Silent, once you put a stain of blood on me. I've never forgot the taste. It's going to be washed out today or else made redder. It was here that you put that stain." He struck the long rider lightly across the mouth with the back of his hand, and Silent lunged with the snarl of a beast. His blow spent itself on thin air. He whirled and struck again. Only a low laughter answered him. He might as well have battered away at a shadow. "Damnation," he yelled, and leaped in with both arms outspread. The impetus of his rush drove them both to the floor, where they rolled over and over, and before they stopped, thin fingers were locked into the bull neck of the bandit, and 2 thumbs driven into the hollows of his throat. With a tremendous effort, he heaved himself from the floor, his face convulsed. He beat with both fists against the lowered head of Dan. He tore at those hands. They were locked as if with iron. Only the laughter, the low, continual laughter, rewarded him. He screamed a thick, horrible sound. He flung himself to the floor again and rolled over and over, striving to crush the slender, remorseless body. Once more he was on his feet, running hither and thither, dragging Dan with him. His eyes swelled out, his face blackened. He beat against the walls. He snapped at the wrist of Dan like a beast, his lips flecked with bloody froth. That bulldog grip would not unlock. That animal, exultant laughter ran on in demonic music. In his great agony, the outlaw rolled his eyes and appealed to the crowd which surrounded the struggling two. Every man seemed about to spring forward, yet they could not move. Some had their fingers stiffly extended as if in the act of gripping with hands too stiff to close. Silent slipped to his knees. His head fell back, his discolored tongue protruding. Dan wrenched him back to his feet. One more convulsive effort from the giant, and then his eyes glazed. His body went limp. The remorseless hands unlocked. Silent, fell in a shapeless heap to the floor. Still no one moved. There was no sound except that deadly ticking of the clock. The men stared fascinated at that massive, lifeless figure on the floor. Even in death he was terrible. Then, Dan's hand slid inside his shirt, fumbled a moment, and came forth again bearing a little gleaming circle of metal. He dropped it upon the body of Jim Silent, and turning, walked slowly from the room. Still no one moved to intercept him. Passing through the door, he pushed within a few inches of two men. They made no effort to seize him, for their eyes were upon the body of the great lone rider. The moment Dan was gone, the hypnotic silence which held the crowd broke suddenly. Someone stirred. Another cursed beneath his breath. Instantly, all was clamor and a running hither and thither. Buck Daniels caught from the body of Jim Silent the small metal circle which Dan had dropped. He stood dumbfounded at the sight of it, then raised his hand and shouted in a voice which gathered the others swiftly around him. They cursed deeply with astonishment, for what they saw was the marshal's badge of Tex Calder. The number on it was known throughout the mountain desert, and seeing it, the worst of Dan's enemies stammered, gaped, and could not speak. There were more impartial men who could. In 5 minutes the trial of Whistlin Dan was underway. The jury was every cowpuncher present. The judge was in public opinion. It was a gray-haired man who finally leapt upon the bar and summed up all opinion in a brief statement. Whatever Whistlin Dan has done before, he said, this day he's done a man-sized job in a man's way. Morris, before he died, said enough to clear up most of this lad's past, particular about the letter from Jim Silent that talked of a money bribe. Morris didn't have a chance to swear to what he said, but a dying man speaks truth. Lee Haines had cleared up most of the rest. We can't hold agin Dan what he has done in breaking jail with Haines. Dan Barry was a marshal. He captured Haines and then let the outlaws go. He had a right to do what he wanted as long as he finally got Haines back. And Haines has told us that when he was set free, Barry said he would get him again. And Barry did get him again. Remember that. And he got all the rest of Silent's gang. And now there lies Jim Silent dead. There's only two things to remember. The first is that Whistlin Dan is rid away without any shooting irons on his hips. That looks as if he's come to the end of a long trail. The second is that he was a bunkie of Tex Calder. And a man Tex could trust for the avenging of his death is good enough for me. There was a pause after this speech, and during the quiet the cowpunchers were passing from hand to hand the marshal's badge which Calder, as he died, had given to Dan. The small, bright shield was more convincing proof than 100 arguments. The bitterest of Dan's enemies realized that the crimes of which he was accused were supported by nothing stronger than blind rumor. The marshal's badge and the dead body of Jim Silent kept them mute. So an illegal judge and 100 illegal jurymen found Whistlin Dan not guilty. Buck Daniels took horse and galloped for the Cumberland house with news of the verdict. He knew that Whistlin Dan was there. Well, this is chapter 38, The Wild Geese. So when the first chill days of the late autumn came, the four were once more together. Dan, Kate, Black Bart, and Satan. Buck and old Joe Cumberland made the background of their happiness. It was the latter's request which kept the wedding a matter of the infinite future. He would assign no reason for his wish, but Kate guessed it. All was not well, she knew. Day after day, as the autumn advanced, Dan went out with the wolf and the wild black stallion and ranged the hills alone. She did not ask him where or why, for she understood that to be alone was as necessary to him as sleep is to others. Yet she could not explain it all, and the cold fear grew inside of her. Sometimes she surprised a look of infinite pity in the eyes of Buck or her father. Sometimes she found them whispering and nodding together. At last, on an evening when the three sat before the fire in solemn silence, and Dan was away, they knew not where, among the hills, she could bear it no longer. "Do you really think," she burst out, "that the old wildness is still in Dan?" "Wild?" said her father gently. "Wild? I don't say he's still wild. But why is he so late tonight, Kate? The ground's all covered with snow. The wind's growing sharper and sharper. This is a time for all reasonable folk to stay home and get comfortable beside the fire. But Dan ain't here. Where is he?" "Hush," said Buck, raised a hand for silence. Far away, they heard the wail of a wolf crying to the moon. She rose and went out to the porch of the house. The others followed her. Outside they found nothing but the low moaning of the wind and the snow, silver glimmering where the moonlight fell upon it. Then they heard the weird, inhuman whistling, and at last they saw Dan riding towards the house. A short distance away he stopped Satan. Black Bart dropped to his haunches and wailed again. Dan was staring upwards. "Look," said Kate, and she pointed. Across the white circle of the moon drove a flying wedge of wild geese. The wail of the wolf died out. A faint honking was blown to them by the wind. Now a distant jangling chorus, now a solitary sound repeated like a call. Without a word, the three returned to their seats close by the fire and sat silent, staring. Presently the rattle of the wolf's claws came on the floor. Then Dan entered with his soft step and stood behind Kate's chair. They were used to his silent comings and goings. Black Bart was slinking up and down the room with a restless step. His eyes glowed from the shadow, and as Joe looked up to the face of Dan, he saw the same light repeated there, yellow and strange. Then, like the wolf, Dan turned and commenced that restless pacing up and down, a padding step like the fall of a panther's paw. "The wild geese," he said suddenly, and then stopped. "They are flying south," said Kate. "South," he repeated. His eyes looked far away. The wolf slipped to his side and licked his hand. "Kate, I'd like to follow those wild geese." Old Joe shaded his eyes, and the big hands of Buck were locked together. "Are you unhappy, Dan?" she said. "The snow has come," he muttered uneasily. He began pacing again with that singular step. "When I went out to Satan in his corral this evening, I found him standing looking south." She rose and faced him with a little gesture of surrender. "Then you must follow the wild geese, Dan. You don't mind me going, Kate?" "No. But your eyes are shining." "It's only the reflection of the firelight." Black Bart whined softly. Suddenly Dan straightened and threw up his arms, laughing now with exultation. Buck Daniels shuddered and dropped his head. "I am far behind," said Dan, "but I'll go fast." He caught her in his arms, kissed her eyes and her lips, and then whirled and ran from the room with that noiseless padding step. "Kate," groaned Buck Daniels, "you've let him go. We've all lost him forever." A sob answered him. "Go call him back," pleaded Joe. "He'll stay for your sake." She whispered, "I would rather call back the wild geese who flew across the moon. And they are only beautiful when they are wild." "But you've lost him, Kate. Don't you understand?" "The wild geese fly north again in spring," said Buck. "And he'll—" "Shh," she said. "Listen." Far off, above the rushing of the wind, they heard the weird whistling, a thrilling and unearthly music. It was sad with the beauty of the night. It was joyous with the exultation of the wind. It might have been the voice of some god who rode the northern storm south. South after the wild geese. South with the untamed. Well, that's the end of this story, folks. We've been listening to this for a few weeks, and it was a good one. It's, well, there are a few messages in there to be found, and I think if a person looks, they'll find a few more. So, I'm glad y'all came tonight. Glad to see y'all. And we'll do this again real soon. In fact, we'll do it again next week, if not sooner. Good night, everyone. This is Clay Steele, and thanks for coming.